That's a good question. So the project started back in 2009, and at the time, I've come from the Ruby on Rails development world, and there is some colleagues of mine that I knew, other developers, and they had shared over a few years some like their ZSH config files, and there was a bunch of like auto completion tools for like Rake and Capistrano for deployments and such. And so there is a couple of things that I just kind of like started using, and they were like, I could never figure out how to make that happen in Bash, but things like auto completion of file namings on remote servers, for example. And we used to, part of my business used to be manage hosting for companies, and we used to manage a lot of servers, and so that became really came in handy. And so I could like SSH different servers and run commands and have a bunch of autocomplete features and tasks that are kind of simplify and save a few keystrokes here and there. But there was a bunch of things such as we had some. For like Rake, as I mentioned, like some of the autocomplete stuff. So like for different options that you might pass into Rake. And so that might have been something you can do in Bash. I just never spent the time to figure out how to make that happen because a couple of my peers were using Z shell, and I kind of drank the Kool-Aid back then. And so I'm curious about where Bash is now, because now that it's been 7 years plus since I released Oh My Zsh shell originally, that maybe some of these features that we've come to like in Z shell are now available in Bash. And I know there's like Fish and a couple of other terminals that people options that people use these days as well. So, but for the big part, it was a lot of like just auto completion, and like when you hit tab a couple times, you would get like a little menu of options, so you can kind of cursor your way through some options. And that was, at the time, that was just like, it just made the interface so much more, in my opinion, delightful.
Cool. And I said in the opening of the show why I switched over to CSH, which is, hey, you could actually SSH and run things, which is something that only the C shell could do amongst all the shells that I had available to me. But and now I'm take for granted what you just said about auto completion. I mean, I can't remember the first time I typed SCP foo : and out of just habit I typed tab, and it just worked. And I was like, whoa, it's got to have gotten over with an SSH connection to foo and then gone ahead and completed that. I imagine all shells can do that by now, but I don't really care because I don't use the rest of the shells. So what's in the Oh My ZSH project? Let's start with that, and then we'll bring Marc in a few minutes to kind of talk about his involvement with the project. But what am I going to find? What am I getting when I go to Oh My ZSH and the websites associated with that?
Sure. So the big thing that we, at least with the initial version of it, it was a kind of a collection of my, I basically ripped apart my Z shell config file into a little framework, so I could organize like some autocomplete functions and some for different commands that I would run. And then also another big part of it was my command prompt itself. So the layout of my prompt. So using Git for a really long time, having like your Git branch be listed in a directory if you're in a code repository directory. So having to know what branch you're in, and then also knowing whether or not you have any unstaged changes that need to be committed, or just to kind of let you know if your local directory has been dirty and what branch it's in. So things like that was quite helpful. But then also other things like which version of Ruby that was running in that specific directory for that project. But which we have some other tools now to make that life easier. But when you install Oh My Zsh shell now, it's kind of optimized for someone that's kind of new to the command line experience in general. So I was kind of writing it for some coworkers of mine and like front end developers that were kind of getting introduced to Git to start, and then wanting to let them feel a little bit more at ease. And then one way to do that was to allow them to kind of customize their command prompt. And so we created a concept of themes, and so there's, I think, 150 themes, I think, right now in the repository. Probably a little too many at this point, but there's a number of different themes that have different color layouts and pattern palettes, and the way your prompts, sometimes they're like left aligned prompts, sometimes there's right aligned prompts, sometimes there's prompts that have information and details on both sides of that. And now we have things like silly emojis now in your command prompt. So if your local Git branch is dirty, you might have a special emoji for that, maybe like a piece of poo or something, or maybe like, there's people do a bunch of silly things in there now. But so we have like the themes, but then we also, for all these other I mentioned Rake and Capistrano, and like so we have things like plugins for Django, Ruby on Rails, Perl, Python, a bunch of other specific frameworks like Rails and such like that. And so within those, and a lot of things like a Spotify plugin. So you can be on your command line and you can be like run some commands to like start an album through Spotify or through iTunes. And so there's a number of plugins like that. I think there's over 200 plugins now that the community has contributed to the base repository. So when you install that, you kind of access that, and you can just outline which plugins you want to load when you initialize your command prompt.
So part of this could be done not shell specific for a lot of what's in these plugins by just simply having a command that you would apt-get install or whatever you guys do in the Linux world, something like that. I've been told that's the way it is. I don't know anything about that stuff. But why would you build this as a shell specific set of tools like the Spotify thing?
You know, there's a lot of interesting use cases that have come up that I never would have thought of. I mean, when I first created the project, I didn't even have the concept of like plugins and themes that came like in the weeks that followed as people started sending me requests and change requests to the project. But for some of those, like the Spotify one maybe is like a little bit of an anomaly there. But I've heard some people that are using it because they might have a computer, like a Linux computer running in another room or a Mac computer, and they want to be able to control that remotely. And so they'll run some command over a terminal connecting to that computer that is connected to like their server or to a stereo system or something like that in their office. So I hear things like that where people just kind of baking in and making it easier that way. But I know there's probably other plugins and tools out there for those things, but I think we were just trying to make it simple and have a set of conventions and consistent README files for how we do that, and so people can kind of load in their environment that applies to them.
Well, one of the things is that given this is all written in ZSH, which runs just fine on my OS X box, you're right. I don't have to have, somebody have ported some tool to Mac ports. And the fact that ZSH is just so freakingly powerful and being able to open arbitrary TCP/IP sockets and including listen sockets. I mean, the ZSH people are just crazy. You read the documentation for ZSH and it goes on and on and on and on. Like I said, it reminds me of an early Perl in that there's just a gazillion things like the autocomplete, the file name completion is insane. But before we get too much more into that, I do want to bring Marc back into the conversation. Marc, how did you get involved with Oh My ZSH, and what keeps you attracted to it?
I first started using Zshell. I pronounce it Zshell. After a 2012 article in Code Plus, and long story short, in 2013, I wanted to contribute to an open source project, and for some reason I found Oh My Zsh, and I started contributing right away. And the thing that keeps me in Zsh is as you said, there's a big part of Zsh is completion, and honestly, if it was just that, I would be okay. But I also use file globing, which is sort of like pattern matching for files, and it's super powerful. I still don't know everything that I can do with it, and I know there is the find command and all that, but with that and completion, I'm just thrilled to use Zsh. And I can't really comment on Bash or other shells because I haven't used them, but
yeah,
that I'm comfortable with Zsh, and I don't have any reason to leave.